International Conference on Arts and Humanities.
And partially related to perspectives in terms of perception and worldview, differing worldviews that we tend to compare, all of us here. And a bit of that is also in the upcoming session, Visual and Performing Arts. I will be starting the session with an attempt on Antoine Bourdelle's Beethoven-Portraits. We have one change. Dr. Suyata Amane excuses herself. She will be delayed by just an hour, so I've placed her into the section around 12:15. So the second speaker today will be Ms. Gina Sena, how the Korean soap opera influenced Sri Lanka's life. Very exciting talk, followed by Dr. Shiva Gauri from the Commerce and Science College in India with a talk on use of task-based activities in teaching of drama. And then we will have Dr. Suyata with the self-effacing meaning of women in Shashi Deshpande's select short stories. Ms. Sheila Shefa from the Islamic Azad University in Iran will be presenting a comparative study of the intuition in the artist and the psychological process of sublimation in the creation of artistic work in Plato and Freud's viewpoints. And we will conclude the session with a contribution by Ms. Tilini Ferdinando of the Faculty of Humanities, University of Ilania in Sri Lanka. And she's asking the question, what requires in poetry translation is recreation, not a reproduction with reference to selected Sinhala and English poetry translated into English and Sinhala. Today I would like to share with you some observations on the sculpture of Antoine Bourdelle. I will be talking about stylistic ambiguities of a paradigm shift around 1900. Just to introduce you to Bourdelle, this photograph shows Bourdelle as a student in Toulouse. The photograph was most likely taken around 1880. Just to give you an overview of what I will be talking about. First of all, I will be referring to Bourdelle's Apollonian and Dionysian principle reflected in Neoclassicism and Romanticism. I will then go over in the second part to Bourdelle's three inconclusive Beethoven-Portraits cycles, which are situated between 1888 and 1929. And then in the third part, I will talk about Bourdelle's reception of contemporary and historical portraiture, and I will conclude with Bourdelle under the influence of Bergsonian vitalism, introducing time into space. It is quite clear that Antoine Bourdelle's work is dominated by the two principles, the Apollonian principle and the Dionysian principle. But what becomes estranging once we look at this head is this is supposed to be in its regular canon in incorporation of order. And as we can clearly see, looking at the surface structure and texture treatment of this head over here, it is irregular and the surface structure is rough. And we get further evidence once we move ahead a bit to profile view and to rear view. And the other part of his work, in principle and universally, refers to the metamorphosis. And this is incorporated over here with his representation of Daphne in 1910. So Bourdelle's vita as a draughtsman and sculptor is equally determined by both classicist and romanticist tendencies that coin the stylistic divergence. So this is observable, for example, in the confrontation of the equestrian statue of General Alvear on the Plaza de Recoleta in Buenos Aires of 1913 to 26, and that of General Bolívar that remains a mere study of 1914. So with the perfectly balanced composition of General Alvear, which is right in front of us, Bourdelle appears to reinterpret the Renaissance tradition with Verrocchio's Colleoni or Donatello's Catamellata, which were carefully calculated in execution based on mathematics, perspectives, and geometry. I'm showing here the equestrian statue of General Alvear, and as you can tell by the horse, this is a direct adaptation from the Renaissance mode, the canon of representing in a classical, contrasted to the equestrian statue of General Bolívar of 1914. So, in Bourdelle's specific individual case, his dialectic fantasiacal conclusion of thesis, so neoclassicism and antithesis, romanticism on the other side, appears to give a synthetic birth to the creation process itself that is universally constitutive of coinciding opposites. In fact, most frequently utilized terminology in Bourdelle's lectures, and according to his students, are ordre, architecture, construction, synthèse, unité. If we look at these two modes, just to reduce this and to contrast once again the neoclassical approach and the romanticist approach, linearity is confronted with curvilinearity in structure. So rarely any sujet is more relevant to reconstruct Bourdelle's evolution of ambivalent form than his portraiture of the composer Ludwig van Beethoven, than the artist created throughout his lifetime during a time span of no less than 41 years. So 21 sculptural portrait variations, the first at the beginning of his career in 1888 at the age of 27, the last in the year of his death in 1929 at the age of 68. And up until the end of his life, the intermediary experience with the contouring process of Beethoven's busts comprised, while fluctuating between different media of sculpture, drawing, and painting, a total of 76 compositions. So Bourdelle's occupation with Beethoven as an ingenious artist personality was not without obsession. But what motivated Bourdelle to occupy his visual mind with the task of representing Beethoven in most distinguished variations persistently at different stages of his life? As much as Bourdelle favored Beethoven as a composer, he spiritually identified with him as an anti-academic artist, genius, who searched for an absolute expression in his unconventional compositions. To Bourdelle, sculpting is synonymous to composing. Historically, Bourdelle and Bourdelle's very particular affinity with Beethoven becomes explicable through the dual nature of his compositions that are devoted to both romantic and classical modes of expression that seem to be as much indecisively pending between these polar opposites as Bourdelle's earlier and later works do. Both Beethoven and Bourdelle received their creative energy through a tension-filled antagonism that powerfully resonates in their artworks. Bourdelle's magnetic affinity with Beethoven's apparently pessimistic facial features surfaced at three decisive periods of his career. It reveals variations of a main theme. Between 1888 and 1891, he introduces his search for authenticity with an initial naturalistic group of 6 sculptures that portray the composer's indecision and melancholy. This is one of them. From 1901 to 1910, his Beethoven-Portraits remained stylistically ambiguous while pending between solidly built linear concept and nonlinear form or formlessness. Around 1900, Bourdelle enters into an experimentally innovative stage of figurative representation in which nonlinearity is challenged. In these 2 or 3 anti-academic studies, his portrait cycle of the composer stormy, even violent creative nature reaches, reflected in facial features, its apex. Towards the end of his life, though, between 1924 and 1929, Bourdelle explores the ideas he had been unfolding during the first decade of the 20th century from a self-critical distance, in a disciplined return to structural linearity that subscribes, despite its realism, to an engaged realism. In conclusion, Bourdelle views in Beethoven, whose compositions are equally situated between classicism and romanticism, the uncertain creative genius that is at work within himself. Any form created and temporarily established transits through continuously refreshed doubt. Beethoven's search for an absolute reflection of pulsating life in music is countered by Bourdelle's own melancholic search for an absolute structural representation of a proactive, processual, artistic personality. This inner urge of Bourdelle is best mirrored in the sculptural variants of Beethoven's Great Tragic Mass around 1901 that marks in its rough surface treatment an explicit anti-academic shift of paradigm, the formerly unknown subordination of beauty ideals to a liberated, impulsively expressive form. But in this particular sculpture portrait entirely without historical precedents, does it structurally echo major innovations in other disciplines of contemporary culture around 1900? How did Bourdelle arrive at such an apparently indifferent form that seems to lack, from a conventional academic viewpoint, portrayal precision? The drastic shift of paradigm in portraiture from mere appearance, beauty, to subjective, energetic, impulsive being, truth, that Bourdelle introduces into art is, in its sovereignty, daringly novel. But there can rarely, however claimed, be any innovation without, at least implicit, historical precedents. Paradoxically, avant-gardes tend to stabilize their still transitory, immediate originality through related, mediating historical reference systems to subconsciously justify their pending, inconclusive existence. For the 15 years that Bourdelle had worked for Rodin as an assistant, he was exposed to the master's naturalism, with which he aimed to contradict sculptural traditions. The latter's attraction to the principle of metamorphosis, his emotional spontaneity in creatively handling physical matter and passion for nervously energetic curvilinear kinesthetics, reflected in dance sketches. Rodin's longing to find a valid formulation for the very essence of being, however, that could eventually be expressed in organically evolving forms remained inconclusive itself and subsequently fragmentary. Bourdelle's chalk drawings of Beethoven, executed around 1900, reveal in their dissolution of facial contours the contemporary influence of Rodin's close friend, the symbolist Eugène Carrière. Carrière's monochromatic sfumato style displays the competitive photorealism dominated by an effervescence of motion brushstrokes that seem to consciously portray the process of creating an artwork. Most significantly, this holds true for a self-portrait of Carrière that the painter created between stage 1 and stage 3 of Bourdelle's Beethoven-Portraits around 1893. Here, the atmospheric mirror reflection of personality, content, and that of the almost unsubstantial structural nature of creation, form, art, identity. Disintegration of line, respectively, subordination of form to color, advocated in the Académie Carrière since its opening in 1890, consequently led, with the alliance of Matisse and Derain, to the Fauvist style that subordinated form subsequently to color. Rodin's and Carrière's influence on Bourdelle was surpassed by that of Honoré Daumier, to whom he dedicated a bust portrait. Daumier's cycle of 36 dynamically grimacing bust portraits, the celebrities of the Juste Milieu, executed between 1832 and 35, correspond in surface treatment to Bourdelle's great mass of Beethoven. Daumier's attempt to liberate form from academic neoclassical restrictions implies, in an exaggeration of physiognomic and physiological characteristics, irregular surfaces and distorted facial features, and this in the Romantic time period. It was late during the second stage of his Beethoven-Portraiture in 1909 that Bourdelle, in tune with the most recently researching interest in Rembrandt's distinguished style, executed heads of the young Rembrandt and the old Rembrandt, to incorporate the evolutionary nature of the Dutch painter's meticulous, cyclical self-reflections at the beginning and towards the end of his life. Bourdelle's sculptural Rembrandt heads are direct adaptations of Rembrandt's self-portraits of the early and later stages that seem to synthetically conclude Rembrandt's profoundly expressive technical mastery. It is explicable through Bourdelle's rough surface treatment of his sculptures, especially that of Beethoven's Romance Tragique of 1901, that he took particular interest in further training his own style through Rembrandt's own rough handling of paint. In essence, Bourdelle's selective perception gained attraction to Rembrandt's anti-classical, free-spirited, earthbound manner in which the master portrayed emotive actions completely unidealized. Rembrandt deviated from the static academic tradition of Dutch portrait culture in alternating energetic forms, dynamic silhouettes, hands, faces, etc. Executing canvases in complex layers of bold, broad brushstrokes, especially at later developing stages of his career past 1640, his technique became growingly experimental to let speedily expressed forms correspond, as Rembrandt himself said, with the most natural movement. I would like to conclude with Bourdelle's reception of Bergson's vitalism around 1900, which implies the introduction of time into space. What exactly triggered Bourdelle's own shift of paradigm that he was seeking to stabilize with specific historical iconoclastic streams of facial disintegration that reaches back to the late 18th, respectively the beginning of 19th century France? It was around 1900, in the literary circle of the symbolist novelist Jean Moreas, that Bourdelle entered into an exchange of thoughts with the French philosopher Henri Bergson, who had advocated in his seminal study Essai sur les données immédiates de la conscience essay on the immediate data of consciousness, in 1889, The Principle of Vitalism. It is this immediacy of consciousness that mattered the most to Bourdelle with regard to perception and representation of objects in nature. Qualitative perception, sensation of the human subject. Whereas relative perception reflects homogeneous duration, fundamental perception contemplates heterogeneous moments. In homogeneous duration, a perceived object appears discontinuous, immobilized by distinct, mutually exclusive outlines that are dictated by abstract, rational categories of thought. As discussed, Bourdelle repudiates academically established neoclassical modes of symbolic representation. Instead, he advocates with Bergson the notion of heterogeneous modes. Perceptions and impressions melt into one another and thus expose the flux of duration in its indivisible flow of reciprocally interacting parts. Subsequently, Bourdelle deals with the dissolution of matter, respectively the disintegration of facial features, in the process of creating. This very particular attempt to let being into art finds one of his most distinguished reflections around 1900 in Beethoven's Grand Tragic Mass. The Bergsonian distinction between spatial materialism, perpetuity, and temporal spiritualism, immutability, strongly influenced the early modernist turn to non-objective art that Bourdelle could yet not establish. The features of the former, perpetuity, exteriorized spatial materiality, abstractness, were diametrically opposed to those of the latter. Immutability, interiorized temporal spirituality, concrete, non-symbolic representation in the visual arts, and especially they concretized this in music. Thank you.